The next big visit for Prime Minister Narendra Modi is going to be the United Kingdom. Indo-UK ties very important for the Indian administration. I'm being joined by Conservative MP Mr. Daniel Hannan. Many thanks for joining us here on NewsX. A very important visit for Prime Minister Narendra Modi. We know that there are important ties that would be discussed between the two countries, but beginning with what you have been really propagating and talking about, Anglosphere. India is one of the countries that has a large population speaking English, and English is either their first or certainly the second language.
Yes, India is the largest democracy, the largest English-speaking democracy, and it's interesting to reflect on the things that set both our countries apart from their immediate neighbours. You know, it's the easiest thing in the world to take for granted what's familiar. But there are not many countries in the world where the army doesn't interfere in politics, where elections don't result in anybody being exiled or shot or put in prison, where the law is open to the individual, not an instrument of government control. And I think these are values that transcend geography. I think that there is a link between Britain and India that rests on habit and history, on language and law, on commerce and kinship. There isn't a town in my constituency that doesn't have some connection to the subcontinent. And I think these are genuine, organic ties that reflect a shared outlook.
Increasingly, do you think that really needs to be reminded, Mr. Hannan, because we know that we've talked about and a lot of people have been discussing, not so many, of India's contribution in World War I, of how India and UK are closer in their cultural and traditional history than India could be with any other country. Do you think that's lost on many people now in India, given that a lot of talk and narrative has moved from what the history really was to what it should be, moving away from the Western culture to really adhering to and sticking to, we have constituencies within India now that talk about being Indian and only Indian?
I don't know how it is thought of in India. I can only tell you that in the UK it's something that's very important to us. We're now on the centenary of the First World War, and it's an awesome thing to consider the sheer numbers. 1.3 million volunteers came from India. There was no conscription. Every one of those men had taken a personal decision to enlist, and they saw action in every theatre in the First World War, in Europe, in Gallipoli, in Mesopotamia, in East Africa. And you've got to ask at this juncture, what force was so powerful that it would pull these young people from the Ganges plains to the cold mud of Neuve-Chapelle? What was such a magnetic power that it made farmers in the Deccan drop their ploughs and pick up rifles and go to German East Africa? Now, I don't want to oversimplify this. You know, some were doing it for economic reasons. Some were attracted by the thrill, as boys in every age and nation are. Some wanted to strengthen the case for self-rule. But we shouldn't disregard what the men themselves gave as their number one reason, which is a belief that they were fighting for freedom, for a system that elevates the rule of law and the freedom of the individual. And that, I think, is still something that distinguishes India from a number of its neighbours in the region. I think, frankly, it's something that has, for a long time, distinguished the United Kingdom from a lot of our neighbours. And that's the real bond between our countries. It's not to do with borrowing each other's words or cuisines or anything like that. It's a shared commitment to the idea of liberty under the law.
Coming back to Indo-UK ties and Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to the United Kingdom, it is going to be important. He's had a lot of visits in the past. A lot of people asking that there are promises that have been made. He's met with the leadership of Britain before. But in terms of delivery, what can one really expect?
You know, it's surprising to a lot of people outside Britain how little autonomy Britain has as an EU member. So I think there are two particular things that would be in India's interest, but neither of them can be delivered by Britain without permission from Brussels. One has to do with migration. We talked a moment ago about the volunteers in the First World War. I think it is a disgrace that the families of those men now find that they can't bring auntie over for a wedding. You know, when she has no intention of remaining in the UK because we've had to restrict our visa regime so much in order to free up unlimited space for EU nationals who may have zero connection to the UK. You know, I think it is a shameful thing that an Indian army veteran who may have fought for us when we most needed help in the Second World War is queuing up in Heathrow with the others when someone who may have been on the other side is able to stroll in without any questions being asked. I think that's the first thing. But in practice, as long as we have to open our borders to 600 million EU nationals, we're not able to pursue the kind of migration policy that we would want to, which gives a fair wage to people with a family connection to the UK.
Which also brings me to the other question. The other important aspect would be visa liberalization, something that that India has been looking at UK to have done some time ago, but it really hasn't come through, apart from the fact that getting a visa somewhat has become a little easier in terms of process, but in terms of really getting the numbers in place, that really hasn't happened.
In practice, it's become much harder. You have to provide all this proof of income and so on. I mean, I have constituency cases every day from India and indeed from the rest of the subcontinent with people experiencing the same basic problem. And it's wrong. It's also stupid from our point of view. Indian students used to be the largest numerical component in UK universities, and they're now all chased out at the end of their degrees. How does that help anybody? Why are we pushing people away at the most productive, inventive moment of their lives? How have we come to be in a situation where you have to turn away a qualified computer engineer from Bangalore in order to admit unlimited numbers of unskilled workers from Bialystok? Right? No one would have designed this. That is a consequence of our membership of the European Union, and it's not something we're going to address until we leave the European Union. So I was going to come on to the second issue, which I think also impacts on UK-India relations. We cannot, as long as we're in the EU, sign a bilateral free trade agreement with India. Okay? We used to have a very good commercial relationship. We used to buy all of our textiles from the subcontinent, and many of our commodities. It would still be enormously in our interest to have unrestricted access. But, protected, vested interests elsewhere in Europe don't like the idea. And as long as all of our trade is controlled by the European Commission, we can't act unilaterally. So again, those are two specific ways in which I think UK-India relations could improve once Britain recovers its sovereignty.
The other aspect between India and UK is going to be the security aspect. Prime Minister Narendra Modi is going to raise certain very specific security-related issues to do with Dawood Ibrahim, to do with the fact that Pakistan foments trouble within India from various countries also, and is going to provide dossiers with regards to assets that Dawood Ibrahim has. On that front, what is the kind of cooperation that one can expect from UK?
Well, the Prime Minister recently made a very powerful speech about combating extremism, combating religious intolerance, which is, as we know, not a speciality of any particular religion, but we have a terrorist problem which is dragging a number of boys who were born in the UK to the battlefields of Iraq and Syria. And I think that is a battle for hearts and minds. That's not just a security question. I think we need to put a better ideology in place. The way to defeat a bad idea is with a better one. Not by keeping tabs on every citizen who might conceivably be at risk. It's by showing people that there is a better way of living, one based on pluralism and freedom and personal autonomy. It's a great system, freedom under the law, that has raised both our countries to levels of prosperity that we've never known before. Compared to the wretched ideology offered by Islamic State, come on, that's a no-brainer, isn't it?
What about assurances that one can expect from UK when it comes to, again, Dawood Ibrahim, or for that matter, some reports of Khalistanis being supported and abetted by Pakistan?
Well, I mean, that's not directly a UK issue. It's an internal Indian issue. There are some organizations that are on global terrorist lists, and of course, we keep our obligations as a member of the international community. But I think, ultimately, I'm actually fairly optimistic about the improvement of relations between India and Pakistan, because a lot of the things that were being quarrelled over are just seeming to belong to a different age. When in an era of globalization, internet, rising middle class, some of the quarrels just seem archaic now. And I think that the good relations that you can see between Muslim Indians and other Indians is a model for how it can be in a country where there's rising prosperity.
Final question, the fact that he will be going to UK, there's a huge Indian community, an Indian diaspora event awaiting him and waiting for him to be there, to be present at that event. But right now, domestically, whatever is happening on the ground in India, do you think it is affecting India's image abroad? Do you think it will affect India's image and Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to the UK with the kind of narrative that has changed, with the kind of intolerance that we are seeing, growing intolerance to do with caste, religion, and other aspects of somebody's being?
Again, I think you have to take a long-term view. India is a more pluralist and more tolerant place than it was 30 years ago or 60 years ago, just as Britain is and just as all countries with a tiny handful of exceptions are. And the reason for that is greater prosperity, which brings people together. The free market is a wonderful way of connecting people who otherwise might not have liked each other. You're right, there are 1.5 million Brits of Indian origin. They are arguably our most successful, most assimilated and wealthiest ethnic minority group. And they, of course, will be delighted by the way in which, as we all are, that technology is eliminating distance. And this is the great thing. A country no longer needs to be defined by its neighborhood. Geographical proximity has never mattered less in the world than it does today. The technology has just overtaken all of those distances.
But do you think India's image is taking a hit with the kind of instances, growing instances and incidents of intolerance that is being witnessed here in India? Is there a hit that India's image is taking with that?
This may not be what you want to hear, Geeta, but I'll tell you a funny thing I've noticed, that generally, the countries that have the least problem with intolerance and racism and so on are the ones that agonize about it the most. And in a way, that agonizing is a sign that the problem is being cured, because people are now aware of it. It's not acceptable to say things that it would have been acceptable to say 20 years ago. You just can't say it in decent society. So no, I'm very optimistic about India. Of course, when you're involved in a heat of an election campaign, you look at these little details. But in the broader scheme of things, it's an amazing thing that this has been a successful pluralist democracy, that it's worked without anyone ever coming to grief, being disqualified or banned as a political party. And as I say, the great thing is that distance doesn't matter anymore. Values transcend continents and link people with a shared thinking. Right? And we need to decide. We have a referendum next year about whether we're going to be in the European Union. We will also be facing the question, are we defined by our vicinity, or do we remember older alliances with older friends? Now, those Javans whose names are carved onto the Menin Gate at Ypres, or indeed the sepoys whose names are here in New Delhi on the India Gate, they gave their answer to that question. They were in no doubt that freedom was something worth fighting for on all the continents. And I hope that when the time comes, my countrymen, including, indeed, especially my countrymen of Indian origin, will give the same answer.
On that note, many thanks for joining us. That was Daniel Hannan speaking exclusively to NewsX. In New Delhi, Geet Mohan for NewsX.